Hey, what's up YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. It's Christine with gaugegirl Training, an online meal planning and coaching service. I'm a food scientist and chemical engineer by training, and in today's video, I'm going to answer the question, is fat bad for you? So let's get started. So before we get into this video topic, please give me a follow on Instagram at gaugegirl Training. If you want to see my clients' transformations, check them out at GGT_transformations. So in today's video, we're going to talk about, is fat bad for you? It's a common question. It is a common misconception about fat, and we're going to debunk those myths, explain where they came from, and what you really need to know about fat as a macronutrient. So our society has a deeply embedded feeling when it comes to fat, where fat is a bad thing. And it is certainly clear being overweight has some negative effects, but we have been misled to believe that consuming dietary fat equals an increase in your stored body fat. The problem is there's a lot of conflicting information out there. There are some sources that say fat is bad for you, do not eat butter, do not eat bacon, it's going to clog your arteries, where other sources say eat all the fats, it's good for you. So we're going to separate those two things, explain what's what, and get to the heart of the matter. The reason there is a lot of confusion around fat intake all stems back from as early as the 1950s in a study published by Dr. Ancel Keys. Now, Dr. Keys published a study that showed the relationship between saturated fat intake and mortality from heart disease. And in this study, he specifically selected a total of 7 countries which showed a correlation between the more saturated fat you consume, the more likely there is to be mortality from heart disease as a result. Now, his data analysis made sense. If you look at this chart, you can see it appears to be a correlation. However, correlation does not always equal causation. If you look at this next set of data, where a total of 22 countries' data with respect to saturated fat intake correlated to mortality from heart disease are put together, you can see that this data does not support the conclusion that increased saturated fat intake is the cause of increased mortality from heart disease. The problem with this is the fact that before a larger data set was looked at, the preliminary study was actually used by the USDA, FDA, and many other governing regulatory bodies to base a lot of laws, a lot of labeling regulations, and a lot of standards that snowballed into an entire industry and food industry of low-fat food. Now, when Ancel Keys published his study, the data from 16 other countries was not available at that time. And it was found that those who consumed the highest percentage of saturated fat, in fact, had the lowest risk of heart disease. And despite all of the scientific evidence that points to the fact that saturated fats are not bad, there still exists a dogma that low fat is good, high fat is bad, and it even remains a favorite among government health authorities. And everyone from the government to doctors back in the day did support this theory. And patients with a risk of heart disease, but for the entire nation throughout the 80s, the 90s, everybody was cutting back fat from their diets in a way to avoid chronic illnesses such as obesity and diabetes. And this led to a whole low-fat food industry, everything from non-fat milk, non-fat yogurt, and just the stigma that steak and butter and eggs are bad for you, when in fact they are not. The reality is that consuming dietary fat does not activate the hormonal triggers that causes the storage of body fat. Let me repeat that. The reality is that consuming dietary fat does not initiate the hormonal triggers that initiate the storage of body fat. So here's what happens, you guys. Insulin is the fat storing hormone, and it is activated by the consumption of carbs and sugar, not fat. When you consume carbs, it causes a spike in your blood sugar, which causes a resulting spike in your insulin. Insulin is a fat storing hormone released from the pancreas. Now, insulin is trying to reduce your blood sugar by shuttling the glucose into your cells, and anything excess will be stored as fat. Being in a state of high blood sugar is toxic to your body, and if you have so much sugar in your blood that your muscle cells cannot hold it anymore, your body's gonna move it all out of the way of the blood and store it as fat. So number one, your blood sugar is not toxic, and number two, so that way you have energy reserves. Dietary fat consumption actually slows down blood sugar spikes, and it slows down the rate that your body needs to release insulin, which is actually a good thing, because when you're doing this at a slower rate, your blood sugar is more stable, and you're not going to have extreme changes in your energy levels, which tends to happen when you are a little bit lower in fat, because the fat will slow it down and keep your blood sugar a little bit more stable, because the rate at which the sugar is spiking your blood is slower. All fats are not created equal, and I will get into that in a separate video, but people do need to take personal accountability for learning and understanding how food affects their body. There is a serious need for people to change the way they look at food, because the entire country shifted to low fat, and the obesity epidemic went through the roof, where over 60% of women and 75% of men are considered obese. So the problem isn't fat, you guys. The problem is how we look at food, how much we consume, and our overall mindset and the way we approach it is completely off. The primary role of fat in the human body is to be a source of stored energy, along with many other biological functions, but the main function is to be a source of stored energy in the event of scarcity. Like I was saying in the last video, think of carbs like cash. When you need money for something real quick, like you're going to use your checking account. In this case, the checking account is carbs. Now, the savings account is fat. So your body wants to hold on to it in the event of scarcity, it wants to keep it. It doesn't really want to part with body fat. Now, unlike carbohydrates and protein, your body has a limited ability to store protein and a limited ability to store carbs. However, fat, your body has an unlimited ability to store fat. Your body will keep storing it. If you keep eating, it will keep storing it and keep storing it and keep storing it and keep storing it. It has an unlimited ability, which is crazy if you think about it. And this means that while fats are good for you and there are specific benefits to it, you cannot just eat fat with reckless abandon either. So while foods like salmon, olive oil, avocado, they are good for you, they have a good reputation for being healthy fats, it does not mean that you can just eat them with abandon. They are still very energy dense sources with more than twice the energy of carbs and protein. So if you go overboard on your fats, you will gain weight from being in a caloric surplus. It is not because it is fat as a macronutrient, it is the result of being in a caloric surplus, which will cause you to store excess body fat. But the key of this video is that consuming fat alone cannot trigger the hormones needed to cause your body to store fat. So eating fat does not make you fat. If you eat a caloric surplus, that will cause you to gain weight. So there are two distinctions. Please make sure you keep this in mind. I'll do another video explaining the differences in fat, which ones are good for you, which ones are bad, and why. But thank you guys for watching, and if you have any questions or concerns, please comment below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.